And now from our September 2nd podcast, my conversation with Susan Olsen on Sununu and Waterville Valley.
Well, you know, it's weird how all of this sort of came together at once. But I've got a little bit longer history with this. Late last year, I was looking around at who was going to be running for governor and who I thought might be sensible and not. And the first call, of course, was baby Sununu. And I started going through the executive council records and the votes and whatnot. And it's fairly perfunctory. I mean, most of those guys there don't read the contracts and don't do the work. So I'm thinking, let's look at this. This kid is, 40 years old. He's all of a sudden decided that he's going to run for governor, and he's the head of this big ski resort, and Mr. Family Guy, and I'm thinking, maybe I'm going to go look around Waterville Valley and see if there's anything there that might be interesting. And I did, and the first thing I came across was something called the Green Peak Expansion. I mean, after I looked into the moderately tawdry history of Waterville Valley as a whole, you come across post-acquisition by the Sununus this proposal to expand the mountain, to add new trails and other things about skiing of which I know very little. But I didn't realize until that time that Waterville Valley Ski Resort is actually in a U.S. forest, and the Sununus, baby Sununu, holds what's called a special use permit. And the special use permit allows him now, as the new owners of this 40 and 50-year-old ski equipment, to, much like any federal royalty, you get to use the federal land in exchange for paying a part of your earnings back to them and maintaining the property and undertaking all sorts of, maintenance things to ensure that the federal land is kept in good shape. So I started looking at the special use permit. And it's, I think right now it's a 35 or 40-year permit. I should pull it out and talk to you about it. But what it does is it grants baby Sununu the right to operate ski lifts and various other things on federal land. It allows him to do some construction of equipment, some maintenance of equipment, all with permission granted by the Forest Service and compliance with any number of different regulatory schemes, whether it's USDA, which the Forest Service is part of, or EPA, clean water issues, things like that. So when Sununu picked up the property, he was transferred this special use permit, and I think he realized at the time that because all of the private land in Waterville Valley was owned by somebody else, that there was no opportunity to make any money off developing real estate like they're doing now at Loon and other places. The only way he can make money off this thing, it looks like, is lift tickets and fried dough. So the equipment there, nothing had been done to it in years and years and years. There hadn't even been a brand new condominium built on private land since 2006. So Chris goes to the Forest Service and says, look, I want to add this on. This has been part of what's called the master plan. You're familiar with that from the regional planning commissions. And in the master plan, it was always intended to move over and build these additional trails. So he submits it, and they do all the studies. Takes a couple of years. Forest Service comes back and grants him this expansion. So all of a sudden, he's got equipment and money in this. No, I'm kidding. he does nothing. Nothing happens on the expansion. They go out and cut down a tree or two and do lots of photo ops, and nothing happens. 2 years later, actually 2014, they submit a request for modification to the plan that would still have these additional trails and whatnot, but instead of buying a brand new, spectacular, state-of-the-art lift to move people from the resort, the bottom of the base, up to the various ski places, they said, you know what? We've got this called World Cup Triple that was installed in 1985 and was used for a while, but really was passed over by another lift that was built later. And gosh, then it was hit by lightning in 2000, so we kind of haven't used it. But we're going to rehab it. We're going to take it apart, move it over to Green Peak, and we're going to save a whole lot of money on this project. So I'm reading all this stuff, and again, back in November, I contacted the Forest Service to ask to look at the project files because what's on their site is incomplete. And I got nothing. Emails, phone calls, nothing. Until maybe the 1st of July. And I get an email from the new ski supervisor for the Forest Service who says, here are the files you requested. And I said, well, I would like the entire Waterville Valley file, and back and forth. And the short version is we made an appointment for me to go up and look in the files and see everything, right?
Okay.
So on August the 8th, I get in my little car and tootle myself up to Campton, exit 27, off of 93, and I sit in the office of this absolutely lovely young woman for about 3 hours. And she had been kind enough to put together a 3-ring binder and make some other copies. She let me sit next to her at her laptop and copied files electronically onto a big 16-gig flash drive that I bought to, not cut down any more trees than Chris needed to. So I walked out of there with 86 megs of files and 2 bundles of hard copies. And I come back and start looking at this stuff. Well, 8th of August, we go up and talk to this woman. And she was quite candid. She was relatively new. She'd come to New Hampshire from Vail, where she'd been one of the supervisors out there of those various projects. And they're pretty fancy schmancy and well-known and well-attended and well-developed. And she said she'd done it to bring her kids up in a more rural, quieter place. And she says, but she'd never dealt with anything quite like Waterville Valley before. And I was saying, well, what's going on? I mean, I can see where he wants to save money on the lift, and why is this not happening? I said, is he, just playing like he's going to add the expansion so he can add some value to it and sell it? I said, why is nothing going on? There hasn't been snow, so there haven't been construction constraints. And she says, well, frankly, she says for the project to go forward, there's a considerable number of trees that have to be cut for the trails and also the other, I think they call them glades. And I said, well, why hasn't he done that? She says, well, the Forest Service controls those contracts. We, being the Forest Service, let those contracts to private companies to come in and do the work in accordance with our stewardship requirements. We pay the guy because this is our land, and but it rolls into the value added into the project itself. And she says, but we haven't let the contract. And I said, why? she said, well, she says, we've been after Waterville Valley for quite some time to take care of some pollution issues that they've got. Some sedimentation runoff from parking lots that haven't been managed since, I don't know, dinosaurs walked the earth. And we were, this seems to be the only way that we can focus their attention. She says, now, the funny thing, she didn't say the funny thing, I'm paraphrasing, but she said, I came out from Vail, and nobody likes to, do the maintenance and the environmental work. And she says they put it off as long as they can. She says, but they always have the money to do it. She says, not here. They don't have the money. Or they're not going to spend the money. She said, so we've been sort of keeping this contract at arm's length until we were assured that Mr. Sununu is going to fix these problems that we want, because these are fundamental to the infrastructure. It's nice to have expansions and things like that, but this is maintenance work that needs to be done. So, thinking, well, isn't that interesting? And, had a little chit-chat about her kids and this and that, and picked up my papers and rolled on back here to beautiful downtown Warner. And spent the next week or so going through the papers and whatnot. Of course, they wouldn't show me the actual financials in the royalty calculations for the permit fees, but it's pretty clear. They get a piece of the adjusted gross income, and that income comes from anything, whether it's lift tickets or fried dough or concessions or anything. Any money that's made from the ski resort is figured into the calculation for their fee. Now, bear in mind that lift tickets and fried dough are the primary revenue generators, but also Chris owns something called Town Square, which is the commercial district of Waterville Valley. It's a little, just like it sounds, square of buildings down at the one side of the mountain. You have to get there by car. It's a bit of a jog, but it's a little square thing, and 3 stories, and on the first floor some shops, and on the second and third floors are condos that may be owned or may be rented out. I don't really know all of them, but there's a T-shirt shop and a couple of restaurants, a little convenience store, post office, some empty offices. So I go around there before I left to take a look at that, because in my, somewhat checkered past, I'd done a lot of asset evaluations for clients who were looking either to acquire or to sell physical assets. And I thought, well, let's see what kind of shape this is. And there hadn't been snow, so they should be doing a lot of maintenance and upkeep and whatnot. And it was really quite sad. I mean, whether it was weeds growing through the cracks or rotted door frames or broken sidewalks or the great big entranceway that's covered with a tent-like thing, bleached almost white and looks like it'd been run through a pasta machine. Place is looking pretty ratty. So he's making money off the rents. He's the landlord to all of the businesses in Waterville Valley who may or may not be willing to talk about their experiences. But so he makes money off of rent. The Waterville Valley Town Square is not part of his special use permit, but it's the only other place where he can make money on this deal. So if there's no real estate to develop, because Cochran bought it all in '65 and sold it off here and there for condominium developments, there's nothing else to develop. So why in the world would you buy a run-down, ratty ski lift, if not for 2 things? One, to make yourself look like a boy wonder and Mr. New Hampshire, prepping yourself to run for higher office, or, as what contemporaneously came out with this, was maybe it's a kind of a bank thing. I don't know. But there's two fronts here. One is the fact that the town of Waterville Valley, which actually is held in thrall by Chris Sununu, ever since he bought it, the town property values, as figured by the Department of Revenue Administration, have dropped every year except one slight change. Their property taxes have gone up, except for 1 year for a 20-cent decrease. Their property taxes have gone up every year. Their values have gone down. They've been waiting on this guy to do something with the resort to make their lives better. And I ask myself the question, if Chris Sununu can't make life better for the 300 people he effectively holds in thrall, how in the world is he going to make life better for the 1.3 million people of New Hampshire? It doesn't make sense to me.
It's a good question. I know Kimberly asked it, and I think that, did you read the WMUR had a story out today, and they were making some kind of noise about starting construction on the project? And
I went up yesterday.
You were there yesterday?
He had a 10 o'clock big announcement for everybody that they're announcing the start of construction for Waterville Valley. So I wasn't going to miss that. So I get in my little car, and I've got my little video camera, and I tootle on up to Waterville Valley and pull in, and it's raining, and walk up to the base of the lift. And you know what's interesting, when I was there on the 8th and driving around looking at the parking lots, the lady at the Forest Service told me that she thought she'd seen an excavator, so maybe they were fixing to start work. Well, the excavator was at the base of the mountain, and they put on this big show of using the excavator to knock down a building.
Mm-hmm.
It was going to house part of the new machinery. So now I know where the excavator went, because he didn't do the parking lots. So go up there, and Chris is there. There might be 24 people, I'd say. Half of them were staff or elected officials from the town, or a couple of Forest Service guys. There were looked like some residents, and maybe 3 or 4 media people. That was it. WMUR was there. NH1 was there. Some smaller press outlets, and yours truly. And Chrissy gets out there in the rain and says, you know, the day has finally arrived on the 31st of August that we're going to begin construction of the expansion of a major ski resort. So you ask the question, well, gee, really you start construction now? And how long is this going to take? And, you know, why didn't you start it when there was, you know, the summer and all of that? And he says, well, we just wanted to make sure, you know, that we had all our I's dotted and our T's crossed, and we had the funding to do this. Well, on the 8th of August, while the Forest Service does not have any approval rights over financing plans, the financing plans must show, like any project, on paper, that the money that's going to be expended is going to increase the revenue-generating capacity of the project itself. So, spending another $2 million on what was somewhere around a $10 million acquisition, we don't know what the value is now, except in looking at the tax returns of the Saffet Trust. We've seen that their original investment went up, and then it went back down. They're below their original investment now, and that's not in 2010 dollars. So the value has not increased, apparently, since 2010, and now they're going to dump another $2 million in it. And one thing you might be interested to know this, Steve. Waterville Valley's lift tickets, and day passes are, for last season, let me get my paper here, I apologize. For a day trip at Waterville Valley, an adult lift ticket will cost about $77, which is 57% more expensive than the average lift ticket costs in the United States. An adult can get a season pass for $869, which is 82% more expensive than the average season pass in the United States. Now, I find that intriguing. I understand, when you're building widgets and you have fewer to sell because people aren't buying them, your fixed bonded indebtedness doesn't go away. So your unit price, unless you're willing to go broke, your unit price has to go up. But that's significant, 57% and 82% more expensive than ski resorts in the United States, and they're going to dump more money into it this year. I don't get it.
I'm curious.
I understand he gets Common Core math. I understand he supports that, but this doesn't make sense, even to funny banks.
I'm curious about the pollution issues, though. They claim to be starting on the project, but the Forest Service wouldn't let the contractors clear the trees until the pollution issues were resolved.
Well, the pollution, it was more of a carrot and stick.
Okay.
Apparently, they've been after Sununu, who is, by the way, allegedly an environmental engineer, to repair. There are, I believe, 7 parking lots around the entrance to the base and the lodge and whatnot. And they all look like Hiroshima. So you've got all of this sort of runoff from automobiles and sand and plowing into federal land and federal water bodies. And part of the special use permit requires compliance with the EPA clean water, which I'm not saying that it's right or wrong or good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
But this type of sediment and runoff was apparently not making the Forest Service happy. And they'd been asking for this to be fixed for quite some time. And unless this young lady was not telling me the truth, and I have no reason to believe she wasn't, that they were holding up granting of this tree cutting contract as a way to try and urge or cajole Chris into fixing these runoff issues. There are no silt fences up there that have been built. There's nothing. But all of a sudden, a couple of weeks after people are nosing around and asking questions, we've got the big reveal, and the Forest Service has released the contract. So is that pressure? Is that what? I don't know. I'm not privy to that, and I'm just a little old lady that surmises things.
Sure.
But I 1 and 1 equals 2 generally, and it seems just so specially coincidental.
It does. It really does.
I used to sell coal to some companies in France, and their U.S. representative prided himself on his English, and he was comfortable with slang and loved speaking English, and he loved telling jokes and using idioms. And one day, I forget where we were, but he says, Susan, he says, this supplier so-and-so down in Kentucky, he says, I think they're up to some hanky and some panky. And that just comes to mind when I'm looking at Waterloo Valley.
Well, I bet there's probably an over-under somewhere on how much of this is all just a great big show, and once the primary's over or whatever happens, things will be different. I don't know. I just don't trust politicians, period.
Neither do I. But the folks in Waterville Valley don't have any place to go. They can't fix this.
Right.
They're stuck. The guys that rent these little shops in this town square, the only reason that you'd ever go there to the town square is if the whole facility. Sununu sold the golf course last year.
Yeah.
Peeled that off. There were 2 holes on that 9-hole course that were unplayable. So I don't know, is he selling off assets to raise money? I don't know. But there are people here who are depending on him, who have no other place to go.
Well, it doesn't sound like he's it doesn't sound like he's been a terribly good steward for these folks.
Yeah, and that to me says a lot about character.
I agree.
I get lying politicians. I understand that. But these people are, in effect, his property. This is the plantation that Sununu built. And these folks are not being treated very well, and although they run their town very efficiently, they squeeze their pennies into copper wire, and they run a nice little municipal set of services, but they have no place else to go.
Well, it's not a great place for them to be, that's for sure, and it doesn't sound like Mr. Sununu is doing them any favors. We got about a minute.
I appreciate you giving me a call. I find all of this taken together really interesting.
It is, and I think there's plenty of more interesting things for us to find out, and hopefully we'll find out.
I got 86 megs to go through still.
Oh, Lord. All right, well, as you uncover things, you let us know what you discover.
I shall.
All right, thanks so much for taking time to talk.
Anytime, Steve.
All right, see you, Susan.
Bye.
Bye-bye.